Welcome everybody. And again, as more people come in, because I see people kind of clicking in as we're talking, as you join the call, please introduce yourself via typing your name and organization into the chat. That'll be a great way for all of us to know who's in the virtual room together with us today. And we appreciate that. Uh, if you're joining the call muted as an audience member, and we're going to unmute you later on when we get into the question and answer session. Um, but it's really great to see everybody and see more and more. And I really appreciate you joining us. And when we set this date a couple of months ago, we didn't know that we were going to be competing with the Democratic National Convention. So thank you for your priorities tonight. My name's Tim Little. I'm the executive director of the Rose Foundation for Communities and the Environment. We're the host of the Puget Sound Stewardship and Mitigation Fund, and the fund is a partnership with Puget Soundkeeper and other community-based organizations that enforce the environmental law and the public health and safety law that protect Puget Sound and keep Puget Sound and communities safe. And the money that we have to grant out in this fund all comes from payments from pollution dischargers that Soundkeeper has managed to educate about the Clean Water Act and other laws, and created, in addition to fixing some of the pollution problem, created some funding stream to support community environmental work. So we've got two interlocking goals with the Rose Foundation and with this fund. The first goal is to protect and preserve the waters of Puget Sound. That's the legal requirement. That's the bar that's set by the court. These are environmental mitigation dollars. We have to report on every single grant that's awarded through this fund to federal court, to the United States Justice Department, to the polluting defendant, and to Soundkeeper. We have to be able to explain what happened with the money and how it benefited Puget Sound. That's the requirement that we have to make, that's imposed by the structure of the Clean Water Act and the environmental mitigation dollars. Now, the other goal we have is to build community-based environmental stewardship, and especially around the intersection of equity and justice. And that's the Rose Foundation's goal. That's central to our mission. And we layer that on to the court-ordered requirements. So here's how it's going to work tonight. Like I said, everybody but me and the speakers is muted. And in an hour, we're going to unmute you all for the Q&A part. But meanwhile, during the panel discussion, you're probably going to have comments or questions, things you want to bring up. Please put them into the chat. And as we're going as best we can, we're going to try to patrol through that and pull those questions up and get them in front of the panel in real time. And if we miss the mark or don't fully answer it, then come back and raise it when we get into the Q&A. And I'm going to ask Laura and Kevin to kind of help keep an eye on the chat with me in case we get a lot of those questions. Now, on our panel, we've got 4 people who've all been in the middle of projects, which sit right on the intersection of Puget Sound water quality and community stewardship and environmental justice and equity. And our goal is that by having this conversation with the panel and with you all, is that we can help you understand more about the kind of projects that we prioritize for support through the fund. And like Laura said, there's an upcoming application deadline on September 28th, and a link to all that information is in the chat. And so, and we'll also make sure that you have contact information for Laura Fernandez and Kevin Hendrick to follow up with questions after tonight if you have questions about how to apply or development of specific proposals. And so in a couple minutes, we're going to swing it over to the panel. But first, I think it's time to introduce Chris Rilling, the Executive Director of the Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. It's their enforcement of the laws that protect Puget Sound and everybody that lives in the Puget Sound area that's generated the environmental mitigation that enables these grants. So Chris, let's turn it over to you.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here tonight with all of you. Really looking forward to seeing some of the applications coming in. As Tim mentioned, I'm the executive director of Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. We're based out of Seattle, but we do clean water work throughout all of Puget Sound. We were established back in 1984, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Waterkeeper organization as a whole. It was started in New York, actually on the Hudson River back in the late 70s and early 80s by a group of fishermen that wanted to reduce or eliminate the pollution on the Hudson River. And they became very active in patrolling the river and then holding polluters accountable. And that really spawned the Waterkeeper movement in the US and across the world. And at this point, there are over 350 Waterkeeper organizations around the world. Puget Soundkeeper Alliance was the 6th Waterkeeper organization in the United States. And our mission is to preserve and protect the waters of Puget Sound. And we do that by getting out on the water, number one, recruiting volunteers to come out with us and really patrol our waterways around Seattle, on the Duwamish River, in South Sound and North Sound. We also have partners that help us with this work. There's a North Sound Baykeeper program based out of Bellingham, and hopefully a new entrance to our Waterkeeper organization in South Sound called the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team. They're in the process of being approved by the national organization referred to as the Waterkeeper Alliance that organizes across all of these Waterkeeper organizations. So back to our mission to preserve and protect the waters of Puget Sound. We do that by monitoring and enforcement. We get out on the water, but we're also doing this electronically, following up on the reports that are submitted by corporations that are required to report on their discharge of pollutions and pollutants into the waterways of the US. So unfortunately, some of those companies don't always comply with the standards and requirements of the Clean Water Act. And through our membership, so by having members that are in these waterways, we're able to bring litigation against some of these companies that aren't complying with the laws. This is part of the Clean Water Act that's referred to as the citizens suit provision. And we take these lawsuits up, not against small companies, but really against chronic long-term polluters that should know better. And when we do litigate against them, we have a very successful track record, over $5.5 million in settlements since the late 90s. All of those funds go to the Rose Foundation. None of those funds come to Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. So we don't profit from any of this money. It really is to hold polluters accountable and to make sure that A, the pollution is stopped, that they take corrective action to eliminate that pollution that was in excess of the requirements and the law, and B, to bring some of these funds back into the communities to initiate conservation, restoration, public access, and other projects to improve the environment and water quality in Puget Sound. So that's our role, and we're very fortunate to have this relationship with the Rose Foundation so that we can take the funds that we achieve through our settlements with these companies and to make them available to communities for community-based restoration projects. So Tim, that's it in a nutshell, our role at Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. You can look us up at pugetsoundkeeper.org. We're always looking for more members because that is the key to our litigation, is we have to have members that are in those areas where the pollution occurs. And when we win these settlements, we put the funding back into those communities to improve water quality and restore the environment. And in the long term, preserve and protect the waters of Puget Sound. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Well, now I think it's time to move into the panel. So let me introduce the 4 panelists and then toss it to one of them to get us started. We've got Willard Brown with us this evening. He's the former Director of Housing and Environmental Programs at Delridge Neighborhood Development Association. Peg and Frank, the Executive Director of Salmon Defense. Tamina Martelli, the Resiliency Programs Manager at World Relief Seattle. And Robin Schwartz, the Advocacy and Development Manager at the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. Now, there's a link to their bios in the chat, so look them up a little bit. But beyond the official bio, we're going to kick it off by asking each of our 4 panelists self-introduce for a couple of minutes, and basically let's start with Pagan. And Pagan, let me ask you. I mean, so how does a nice person like you end up talking to us all tonight? I mean, how did you say something to us? Help us with your life path that led you to working around the intersection of community and water quality and environmental justice. And then when you're done, on to one of the other.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Rose Foundation, for holding this space for us. I am speaking to you from Nisqually ancestral grounds. I am married to William Frank, who is the um, youngest son of the late Billy Frank Jr. The salmon defense was created by Billy Frank Jr. In order to litigate, advocate, and educate on behalf of Pacific Northwest salmon. And so potentially we wanted to be able to, tribes wanted to be able to enter litigation cases as a citizen versus having to put up their treaty rights. So that's how we were created. But we do a lot of advocacy and outreach and education. And we were a recipient of the Rose Foundation grant in 2019, and we were able to bring Medicine Creek Treaty tribal children together to learn about water quality advocacy and salmon, and also help the Port of Olympia and the Squaxin Island tribe start to build the Billy Frank Jr. Trail and Billy Frank Jr. Park. And we participated as family and as a salmon defense, and explained to the Port of Olympia that if you were going to use Billy Frank Jr.'s name, we would like there to be a commitment to restoring the watershed and cleaning up the water down on the down by the port there.
Okay, thanks, Pagan. You want to toss it on to one of the other panelists here? You want to give the introduction to?
Yeah, I don't want to call anybody out, so whoever wants to go next, please go.
Okay, then I'm going to call out Tamina. Oh no, she's walking. Okay, we'll give her to settle down. How about Robin?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody, for having me. My name is Robin Schwartz. I work at the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. It's in the Duwamish Valley in Seattle, and we kind of serve as a liaison between community and the Environmental Protection Agency and the responsible parties, just sort of essentially making sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of communication about the Superfund cleanup. And I came into this field kind of sideways. I grew up in Seattle, but I moved to South Park, which is in the Duwamish Valley, about 15 years ago, and started kind of social justice stuff or organizing stuff when my kids started school here. And I realized there was a big difference in what my community was getting compared to what other communities in the city were getting. And through my work at the school, I met my current executive director, and she showed me the sort of intersection of environmental justice and social justice and race and equity. And that's how I came to DRCC. And I feel like my sort of start, with education stuff has really kind of paved the way to environmental justice. It's kind of hard. I've realized, and my organization has been sort of pivoting more in recent years to see sort of the intersection between all these equity issues. And that is how I got here to DRCC. Thanks, Tim.
All right.
Should I call Willard? Do you want to go next?
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Willard Brown, and I came to be here as a result of my work with the Delridge Neighborhoods Development Association. I joined the board of DNDA when I first moved to West Seattle and moved into the neighborhood of Delridge. I am a resident of Delridge, and so all of the projects and issues that the DNDA was working with the community were important to me. And as a result, I devoted my time to them. And then once I tried to retire from the board, they asked me to come on staff. And so I came on staff, and then over time I became the director of the environmental program as well as director of housing. And so in that role, it was my responsibility to help put together our projects and to help staff and to help the community come together around those environmental projects that we deemed important. And the one that became the earmark of our effort in restoring the environment was the Del Ridge Wetland Restoration and Stewardship Project. That project did receive a Rose Foundation grant, and that project focused on the use of public funds to acquire and private funds to acquire a site, a surplus property that was being sold off by the city and was coveted by developers. It was a natural habitat. It was one of the few standing wetlands in that area, and it was about to be paved over. And so we had to fight quickly and hard to preserve the site. So through a number of associations with the other organizations focused on that same issue, we joined forces with the Seattle Green Space Coalition. We went and fought in City Hall. We prevailed. We had time then to acquire the site and to put to use all of our efforts to involve the community. So we formed alliances with all the local neighborhood folk. We formed an alliance with the local school, and it became the outdoor laboratory for all of the students at the STEM school, which was about 2 blocks away. And so with that, we focused on 3 things. The cleanup of the environment and reduction of flooding, and the introduction of green, sustainable, environmental structures to help clean the water, slow the water, make the water enter the wetland, to improve all of the structures and infrastructure in the area so that the water came to the wetland and that the water was being treated by bioswales and biofiltration swales, which are slightly different, before it moved on to Longfellow Creek. So with that, we have an ongoing project with the school. It is a classroom. School's not in session. We have some concerns about how we're going to continue with the educational aspect of the project without there being a formal school setting to work with students in. So that's why I came to be here. There's a lot more to this project than what I just said, so I'll pass it on to the next person. Who's left? Peggy?
Tamina, I think.
Oh, okay. Hi, Tim.
Okay. My name is Tahmina Martelli. I came to this country as an asylee. So I work for a refugee resettlement and services organization, World Relief Seattle. I believe in this entire call, we're the only non-environmental group. That is not our main focus. We are in the business of social services to resettle refugees and asylees. We've been around since 1979 in this area in Washington. We're part of a bigger global organization serving refugees and immigrants who find themselves in vulnerable positions for the last 40 years. And so that's the pathway I came. And one of the intersections that the most interesting part of equity, when you look at it, is people who don't own land or who are newcomers often find themselves in places where they didn't have a voice in what their environment looked like. If they're in apartment complexes, for instance, where there is no green space around them, but it's safe and affordable, they didn't have a voice in how they were built. They just are living there because that was the most safe and affordable place to live there. And that is often, many times over, you will see people of color, refugees and immigrants and newcomers more grossly affected by issues of the environment and water quality and environmental sustainability. All of those issues impact people of color and refugees and immigrants at a much higher level. And so that's why I am very much drawn to this work because it's important and it's not done often enough from that viewpoint. And so one of the things by listening to the community was where communities wanted to be able to grow food they recognized that they could get to by walking or taking public transportation. And the closest place available to be able to do that was an existing parking lot. So the last few years, 3 years, we've been depaving a little 1.5 acres of parking lot. And so currently right now, in fact, I was wearing a kale costume earlier. We are doing a socially distanced kind of get together with our interns, doing tours in small groups of 5 that are docent-led tours of the site. We have grown into the largest green stormwater infrastructure site, as well as food access. So it's a place where we've done large-scale depave. We're capturing water. The land was donated in partnership with Hillside Church. So the roof of the church, it's a very large roof. So since it's a very large roof and it's right there, we're capturing water from the roof for irrigation purposes, but it's also a really huge boon to the water quality because we're capturing over 300,000 gallons per year. And then we have places for people from 23 countries to grow food, 48 families from 23 countries who are growing food in a variety of ways. We have 5 rain gardens, a bioswale, and a food forest that we're planting, all with community input. They help design it, envision it, they have input in it, and it belongs to the community. Part of the funding we're using from Rose Foundation is once you put a green stormwater infrastructure feature, how do you take care of it? Who takes care of it? How does it work to the best of its ability? And so part of that is having people who speak a variety of languages engage in learning how to take care of green stormwater infrastructure, especially when it's right in the middle of a space where they're already engaged in growing food.
Okay, thanks. You know, and in the course of starting to do the introductions, Tamina, you and Willard both also wove in some overview of your projects. But I wanted to ask, maybe switch it over to Robin, because we haven't really talked about the work you got funded to do, and it also involved a whole lot of community involvement in dealing with rain gardens. But it's your story.
Mhm. So our project is it's a community stewardship project. So our plan is, or what we do is we engage folks from the community and we help train them and give them tools and a framework to lead stewardship events. And so then they're empowered to organize events around rain gardens in the community that were built some years ago, actually with a grant from Rose Foundation, but also other green spaces in the neighborhood. I'm not sure if I made it clear before, but we're in the Duwamish River Valley. So the 2 neighborhoods that we serve, Georgetown and South Park, you know, we have a lot of concerns about runoff into the river and, you know, rainwater pollution. So our hope is sort of this confluence of working to educate and empower and engage community members financially, and also to have them support us in keeping the river cleaner, you know, working towards source control, which means just keeping the river from becoming re-polluted as it gets cleaned. So yeah, that's it. But it's what's cool about it to me is that it's giving job skills, helping folks organize. Most of our community stewards speak a language other than English, primarily Spanish, but we also have Vietnamese, and we're trying to get some Cambodian or Khmer stewards. Yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
Well, just, you know, as a follow-up, I can't remember if it was in the course of developing and submitting the grant or if it was right after the grant got awarded, but you had to make a change in the work plan to deal with reality. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, so initially what I would have liked to do was build more rain gardens, but because I personally don't have a strong technical grasp of what's involved, we realized once I put things in motion that we weren't going to be able to fund the size of rain gardens that would be useful. So we kind of had to pedal a little bit and make the parameters work for us by moving from construction of rain gardens to stewardship of rain gardens, which is in and of itself a skill. I mean, folks need to learn how to do that, and if you don't care for them, they fill up and they no longer do their job. But we did have to be flexible, and thankfully Rose Foundation was flexible with us.
Well, and I also recall that in surveying and targeting where you wanted to put the rain gardens, what you realized that there'd been a bunch of ones that have been constructed in past years, but through lack of community stewardship, they'd fallen into disrepair.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the intention of those rain gardens was that the owners would do the upkeep, but I can't remember if some folks had moved from the properties. It just there was more in the long-term planning for these community assets than we had realized at the time. And it's hard to, when you're in a community for years, or when these assets are there for years and years, it can be hard to establish that continuity and that communication.
Pagan, maybe let's go over to you for a minute. I want to circle back with Willard and Tamina around some of the both. There's some striking sort of similarities and differences in their projects, but I wanted to surface your project a little more. I mean, you had, I mean, in some ways similar to Robin's work, there was a youth stewardship, a youth training involvement in some of your work, and a whole lot more. So Tamina, tell us a little bit more about the project that got funded, if you will. The water quality elements, the community elements.
Yeah, so the community elements and the youth camp. So the youth camp that we got funded for, we were able to help bring Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes. So we had the Puyallup, we had some Puyallup youth, Nisqually youth, and also Squaxin Island youth come and participate in the youth camp. And it was very well structured, and where we used STEM to operate, but we also incorporated Indigenous knowledge into it. And it was one of the best experiences in my life. Before that, I had never really wanted to work with youth as much, and just because it is a lot of work and a lot of extra, you just have to have extra people and extra volunteers to make sure the youth aren't drowning or, doing stuff they aren't supposed to do. So it's a lot of extra stress, but at the end of the day, it was really neat to see. I don't think any of the Medicine Creek tribes have really spent much time since the land has been overtaken. And so it was just really neat to spend different each day at different points of the watershed. And so what we did was we had the youth take water samples, and at each part in Capitol Lake, we also taught them about the Capitol Lake Dam and why it's important to get rid of the Capitol Lake Dam. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but the Capitol Lake Dam was it was made so that the Capitol could have a reflection. And it basically choked out the whole watershed, which has led to a whole lot of problems. And that place is just a mess down there. My husband always jokes around that he wouldn't even stick his finger in there. You might lose a finger if you stick your finger in there. But it's important to try to continue the fight to get rid of that dam. There's salmon that run up it. The Squaxin Island tribe, they have people that go and harvest salmon in that area, and it's just the water quality is so terrible. I hope that one day we'll be able to get rid of that dam, but we educated the students about the water quality and getting rid of the dam. And then we also had them prepare, we had what was called the Festival of the Stachas on the third day. And so the kids prepared prepared paintings and stuff to hang on the stage, where we had brought in Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas to come and help us get the public engaged in this severe problem of water quality and getting rid of the dam. And then also community engagement with the Billy Frank Jr. Salmon Trail and the park was great. And so we are looking forward to, we understand that we understand that that area is so degraded, where the port is, that it may take 100 years, but the commitment is there. And if we work to the commitment, maybe we will be able to see it in our lifetime. But if not, Billy Frank Jr.'s grandchildren will be able to see that, as well as the public and the rest of the tribal members. And also, you know, our Mother Earth will be able to breathe. One of the most important things that Billy taught me was that if he could, you know, why he works so hard is that, and why he never stopped working and he never retired, was if he could just restore the Puget Sound and bring a balance back, then our whole, you know, everybody would be okay. And it makes perfect sense. As we relate back to water is life, and as we fight for the salmon, they need clean water. And you know, it just it makes sense to advocate and fight for salmon.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I guess with the, as we put all these 4 projects kind of out on the table, so to speak, in front of us as a backdrop for the conversation, one of the things that I think becomes really obvious quickly is that although this is a water quality fund, because it's coming out of environmental mitigation dollars related to water pollution, each of these projects has a number of very interlocking dimensions that go well beyond water quality. And so I wanted to bat it back over to Willard and Tamina to talk about some of that, and for the panel to talk about that. I think when we all had our conversation, somebody said, you know, this is fun, but people don't have a single issue. And so maybe Willard, can you kick us off and talk about the multiple issues that the project was addressing with a water quality group?
Yes, certainly. Well, the site itself presented an opportunity, and what we were motivated to do was to secure the site and to make sure that it performed its natural function, and that is to be restored as a highly functioning wetland, and to, in doing so, to address the stormwater issues, the runoff issues, and the flooding in the area. The other big issue had to do with the fact that there is absolutely no investment in infrastructure in this part of Seattle. And as a result, all solutions to rainwater contamination and flooding and those issues have to be green in effect. One of the big problems is if there's nothing to tie into. There is no stormwater system to tie into to carry water anywhere. So the water is going to flow along streets and flow along and then stand in people's yards and on street as if it isn't controlled in a better way. And so what we saw here was an opportunity to bring that to the attention of all parties. The local neighborhood people, the people living in the area had been complaining to us at DNDA about flooding in their neighborhoods, flooding in their yards, about every time there is any sizable storm, you know, they're dealing with raging water coming down the city streets and coming into their properties. So we were aware of the problem, and we had communicated our concerns about those problems on an ongoing basis for a very long time. what is great about this site is it's and there's an opportunity there, and we saw that early on, to bring the water into the site. And so what we had to then uncover as to why is the water not coming there naturally. And so there's a ditch system on the streets in the area. There's inflow culvert and outflow culvert at the site. And the inflow culvert was completely blocked except for maybe a 3-inch, because the rest of it was filled with mud that was made for a very slow entry of water into the site. The other big issue there had to do with the visioning for the site and what the wanted. And so we conducted a charrette. We invited the entire neighborhood. We invited folks who are in the business at City Hall, Seattle Public Utilities, Department of Neighborhoods, all those parties that were that have some sort of authority and some sort of responsibility to be involved. And in doing so, we uncovered 3 things. One, okay, crazy, but for us to have control of the site, we had to acquire the site. All of the grants we applied for, only one funder allowed their funds to be used for the purpose of acquisition. There is a very strong disconnect between how you restore a site and don't own it, and taking ownership of it, restoring it, and then moving forward that way. So we had to be creative, and we were able to figure out how to raise the funds to secure the site. And so acquisition was challenge 1. The second part had to do with the science of all of this, and the infrastructure was in such bad shape, we had to form a partnership with SPU, and we had to have a commitment from the department, SDOT, Seattle Department of Transportation, to address the street issues and to address the water issues with regard to where it was being funneled coming off the hillside. And they were willing partners. And so part of what we also learned through this process is if we present the problems and everyone is aware of the problems, then the solutions aren't that far away. In that we have to stop the flooding, we have to do something about the contamination, and we have to control the flow of the water, leaving the wetland into the Longfellow Creek. So building a plan and a program to fully restore the wetland was the critical piece here for, and then who should be involved and how should we use the site to benefit the neighborhood and benefit community was the third part of this. And so we formed an alliance with the neighbors and with the STEM school. And the classrooms at STEM, each year they added a grade. So we had 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and finally 6th grade. But the curriculum we developed was in 2 parts. We did in-class sort of presentations, and then the students would come and visit the site and do citizen science. And so the students there were the monitors of the quality of water and the changes that were happening over time. And so they continue to monitor and to measure and to record their measurements on the big map in the school. And so you can see a change at the measuring sites over time. In the design of the overall restored wetland, all the kids, we had the classrooms using clay to model a restored wetland and what they would like to see captured in the wetland. And these kids came up with 56 different models made out of clay to scale, because the only thing that they could not touch was the footprint of the wetland itself. But every other aspect of what they wanted to see on that site, they could be as creative as possible. And kids are creative. They wanted Z-lines. They wanted to have food grown there. They wanted to be able to go there and sleep. They wanted to be quiet. They had all these varying and conflicting recommendations, but the thing about it was they put a lot of thought into it. And so in the final design, we incorporated for the kids, a much larger area or staging area so that 2 classrooms could actually be there on the site at once and do their citizen science, their monitoring and whatever, and learn lessons. And so, so that's how this all became so integrated and became a much bigger project with much more input on the oversight and stewardship of the project than we had initially thought would happen. And so the project now, with school not being in session, is focused on the growing of food. The food is being harvested and shared with the Del Rich Grocery, which is the co-op, I should say. And so we're growing food for the co-op at the site. And part of what this is a demonstration garden, and that was always part of the vision that the community wanted. So it touches on a lot of different areas, but clearly the biggest parts of this and the biggest pieces of this is the investment in the infrastructure from Seattle Department of Transportation, and the investment in the infrastructure from Seattle Public Utilities, and all the funds we've raised to do the actual restoration work and to build a biofiltration swell on the edge of the property where the contaminated water will be received and held before it's moved on and across the rest of the wetland. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks, Willard. That gives a really good picture of the project. You know, I wanted to ask you to, I mean, both of these projects that World Relief Seattle did and Delridge did, I mean, you could superficially say they both address flooding issues. I mean, you came at it from really different angles. I think you made the point earlier. You didn't originally consider it a water quality project, right? It was a food project.
Okay.
Tim, you're cutting in and out, so I couldn't.
You're cutting in and out.
Yeah.
You talked. Is that for me or for?
No, for Tamina.
Okay.
I mean, there were some flooding issues related to your project, but you sort of came into this through the door of food, right? I mean, it wasn't an open space that protected. It was a parking lot that was in the way.
I still couldn't catch all you said, but I think I understand what you're getting at. So yeah, so one of the main, there was multiple problems, and I've done similar kind of work in the past to know that when you can solve more than one problem in any space, everybody wins. And there are more than one ways of solving a problem to benefit the entire community. And so what really people wanted was a place they could get to easily and to grow food. It just so happens that the space we could get access to that was perfectly located was paved on a hill and flooded regularly. So everything that could possibly go wrong, if you had to choose like a piece of farmland or a place to grow food, that would be the wrong place. It had everything going wrong with it. But that also presented all of these other challenges that if we could solve them would benefit a much wider community than those who are growing food there. So water quality became huge because it not only floods that neighborhood, but the middle school just down the street. It's a major flooding issue because we're on a very steep incline on a steep hill. So all of these different pieces not only gave us access to land, it brought the community together that normally wouldn't talk about conservation, water quality, or feel connected to the need for that because that's so far removed from making a new life in a new country. There's so many other things happening that issues with the environment or water quality or even sustainability are very far away. But this made it reachable and understandable for everyone participating. And it included the entire community in solving problems that were taking it step by step. So now on this piece of land, we're able to mitigate over 4.4 million gallons of polluted stormwater just by the different things that are in place with a bioswale and a food forest, which also provides food beyond will provide food when it's completed, beyond the initial like seasonal growing season. It's especially during this pandemic, what has brought to the fore is food security for families that are saying over and over, we can rely on things we have planted, we know that we can harvest, that we don't have to wait for someone else, or whether we have a job or not, to have food access. And then the fact that we're able to mitigate polluted stormwater through rain gardens. There's 5 of them on site, and that mitigates over 1.1 million gallons of stormwater, polluted stormwater. And then the depaving that we had to do to put the gardens in. So it's solving a lot of different problems. And then we're also part of the Green Duwamish Problem Design Lab. So it's a place for science classes and also our summer camp programs that we run for K through 8th grade newcomers to prevent learning loss through the summer. And that includes our internships, education about green jobs, and learning on site about all of these concepts. And then learning how people grow food and interact with the land in different ways in different cultures and countries. All of those things coming together in the same space while solving multiple problems and benefiting really the salmon and the orca and coming full circle. And this makes it easier for people who are interacting with that space and land to understand how all of these things affect all of us, whether you own land or not.
Okay, thanks. Well, so that's an overview of the projects that you all are involved in right now. And out of that, one of the things that really comes out is the intersectionality of the issues and the idea that water quality isn't just an abstract thing, that water quality issues a lot of times are connected with other issues in the community. I guess this is just an open question for anybody on the panel who wants to pick it up. So we've talked about flooding a little bit, food as a couple of ways that get into water quality and access the grant, but also can involve some really other community benefits and unlock other community partnerships. What are other things that you think of that are intersectional problems that involve water quality, but also involve other things that communities care about, so that people are motivated to get involved? And maybe in a sneaky way, we build the constituency for Puget Sound.
Well, I'll jump in right here. It is very clear that the community in Delridge in particular was thirsty for some accountability and to have a fair and shared responsibility for the upkeep of the environment and for improvements that were needed so that we could be made whole. There was a strong sense that we had been overlooked and neglected for a very long time. So the water project and the restoration of the wetland paved the way for the creation of a foundation for having discussions about the entire area as it relates to water coming off the hillside, water coming on the streets. It also created the situation where everyone wanted to be helpful. Everyone wanted to participate in finding a way they could become involved in the project. And so being aggressive in how we were discussing the project and showcasing the project, we applied everywhere. We left no rock unturned with regard to pursuing funding, because once acquisition was done, then to actually do the work to restore the wetland and to do the infrastructure and investment required a considerable amount of fundraising. And so I saw a lot of folks' names who are participating in the chat, who registered here, who I worked with while we were developing this project and moving this project forward. And that's wonderful to see. So one of the big success stories is that the neighborhood and the neighbors around the property are the champions of the project. They police it. They make sure folks don't bring their dogs into the wetland and off leash. They there are signs and signage in there, and they make sure that the signs are visible. They do a lot of the upkeep and cleanup around the project on the street sides, on the perimeter. And one of the big improvements to the project is that all of the blackberries and Himalayan blackberry that used to border the project, well, you know, let me say, I popped a few hundred blackberry vines out of that project myself, so I can tell you how rewarding that can be. The neighborhood has sustained that. They have these cleanup parties and they look for it. I mean, every time that it raises its ugly little head, they go after it. So it's sort of like the neighborhood pet project. And so there's a lot of ownership and identification with it. And that is huge. And so that's the other benefit: pride in neighborhood, pride in community. And the other piece is that, and this is the most beautiful part of it, as far as I'm concerned, and that is the STEM students, as they progress from 2nd to 3rd grade, the curriculum, they get to do the curriculum that was done by the grade ahead of them the year before, and they get to continue that work. And so there's this ongoing learning about the project and what it's all about. And those kids who go to STEM can tell you more about the Delridge Wetland Restoration Project than anyone else, because it's right there as part of their daily curriculum. So that's the other big benefit. The goal of the project was to create a generation of environmental stewards, folks who would understand from their very beginning how important it is to have a sustainable, clean environment. So,
Thanks. So in looking at some of the questions that have come in the chat, there's a point raised about our homeless population, is that there's a lot of intersectionality. And some of the folks in the meeting here today may have participated in a workshop that we helped host a few months ago around this. And the point of conflict around homeless people making their home along the banks of the Duwamish, because, you know, that and that's caused some strain and some stress. There's a point here about a partnership with the Olympia Free Clinic to address homelessness and water quality in the Olympia area. We recently have been supporting a project that's integrating some homeless services and riparian stewardship in the Duwamish. I mean, Robin, is there anything I can bat to you on this? I mean, I know that you've been associated with Duwamish Alive a little bit over the years, and I mean, I just want to continue to pull out places where there's a water quality project, but it's doing so much more than water quality, because that's where our bullseye is, and that's the priority for the fund that we're really trying to hit.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of input about homeless, about camping on the river. I mean, I could maybe piggyback a little bit on what Willard was just talking about, though, about kind of the cultural component of bringing your community in. I mean, I feel like one of DRCC's big an important part of our mission is to, you know, we're not trying to lead the way here in this community. We're trying to support community in prioritizing how they want to lead the way. And I think that's why when we're like, for this particular project that Rose has funded, it's not us going in and calling community members in, it's neighbors who speak the language of their community, of their parts of the community, and are calling in their own neighbors. It's our youth do a lot of work in this kind of stuff. They work closely with the stewards, and then they take their messages home to their parents. I mean, our youth corps leader has said that some of the moms come up to her jokingly and are like, "What? Why are you teaching my kids? They keep telling me no plastic cups at our parties." You know, so it's in these little ways that our message can get moved on and elevated. But at a grassroots level. I just think that, and how you were saying, Tim, about growing our constituency, I think that maybe not the only key to making water stewardship be important to all of us, but a significant key is helping to seed the message throughout community members and supporting them in learning about it and finding culturally relevant ways to pass that message on.
I think I'll for maybe for you, Robin, and also for Tamina, there's some job training element woven into what you're doing. So it's not just a question of the water quality benefit, but there's more than that. Can either of you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so especially immigrant and refugee families often are not aware of what jobs are available. So like first generation, there's obvious things like doctors, lawyers, engineers, those are or maybe computer science, those are understood and well understood through many different cultures as like, that's a good solid job. And a lot of the jobs that are coming out, like green jobs or jobs that are even being developed now, are not in the forefront, are not understood, that are not only relevant now, but will be even more relevant in the upcoming future. And so exposure to that and understanding of that, and where the kind of the timeline and future is headed, and what you have to do to get there, that preparation, because often so many of our students, they're going to be the very first ones ever to go to school or college in their family. And so just understanding that, grasping that, participating that early, and opening wide the possibilities. And then seeing the part of the internship program is so that the younger kids who are in K through 8th grade can see someone who looks like them, who has similar backgrounds, that they can aspire to, look up to. It's really empowering to be able to do that, and to know how you can solve problems, affect your community, and do it in a way so that you're also able to make money and make a living out of that as well, and be great for the environment. So bringing that up is really important as well. And I'm assuming that people who are on this call are also wanting to apply for the Rose Foundation grant, or any grant, because really, I work for a nonprofit. We're always looking for funding and figuring out how is it that we can solve the problems that we need to solve, right? And so that's, I think, the main question is, what is it that the community wants? Especially, and part of that, I think, systemically, is working with people in leadership, because I often run across funders and people who they don't have a single diverse person in philanthropy organizations, funders, and others. They're not very diverse, and they're dealing with organizations like us that we are diverse and we're serving a diverse community. And often there's a disconnect in understanding what our community needs and how the money should be spent, and how the funders are telling you they should be spent. And I think part of that is there are some money that I will not accept because it won't fit our community or what needs to happen there. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? So, I mean, part of that, again, is looking at how can we solve problems? What is it the community is saying and asking that they need that can solve more than one problem? And I think it's important to look at those lenses. Yes, water quality is super important. Is it also impacting people and the environment and everything along the way? And who is it impacting? And how can we speak to that and solve it in a creative way?
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I see a couple more questions are coming in through the chat, but also I'm going to ask if Laura Fernandez can unmute herself and surface some questions came up through the registration process, which we haven't. I think some of them we've talked about in the course of the panel, but some we haven't. So Laura, why don't you surface some of the things that the panel can chime in on?
Yes, well, these are like some questions that are more to the application process. So if we're done with the questions to panelists, I feel like this is a good opportunity to address those. Otherwise, we can continue going with the questions that we're having for the panelists.
If there are technical questions about application, let's circle back and close more on those with you.
Right. Yes.
Were there any that had to do with issue-oriented? Well, maybe ponder that for a minute and let me get into some of these other questions, and we can circle back on that.
Sure, let's do that.
Okay. So I think there have been a couple of questions and thoughts surfaced around tribal involvement, and one question about other tribes, and is anybody in the group working with the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes around Duwamish watershed? And yeah, please.
Yeah, DRCC works closely with the Duwamish tribe. They're one of our coalition members, one of our founding coalition members, and also our former ED and our current Superfund manager, James, is a member of the Duwamish tribe. So we try to align pretty closely with them in their goals, and they with us as well.
Okay, thanks. And there's a related question, and it relates to something that I wanted to bring up too. I mean, truly, none of you on the panel fit. If I was going to design a profile of a typical mainstream environmental organization, you wouldn't be it. Sorry. And that's really why we're talking. So what advice do you have to the green groups about how they can better partner with community? You know, kind of go beyond, gee, this is what we're doing, you all ought to join us, to partnering in a way that's community driven and even community led.
Well, I'll jump in here real quick. One of the big principles that we have at DNDA is that we take our lead from the community, and so when we're applying for a grant, whether it's environmental, housing, or social programming, we quickly identify who it is we're going to serve and what problem it is we're going to try to solve. And I think it is very critical to have a clear idea of what the problem is you're trying to solve. And if you have that clearly stated and you come to that clarity through your communication and engagement with your community, then I think you are on the right track. The second part of that is figuring out what level of determination will it take to get to a recognizable conclusion and get to the goals you want to achieve. So anyone who gets involved in a water quality project needs to understand that you're going to be engaged in this for a long period of time. There's no quick fixes, and everything takes time. And so that level of commitment has to be there. And the community that you're working with will recognize if your commitment is there fairly early on. And so if it's there, you're in great shape. And if you're not there, then maybe you shouldn't take that project on, or you should think of the project in a different way. But listening to the community, taking your lead from the community, empowering the people to be part of the decision-making, the neighbors, the students, whomever your constituency may be, is critical. That's my point.
Thanks. Anybody else on the panel want to add to that? I mean, that covered a lot for me.
It is harder to take time to listen to people, but that's the only way to sustain the work, and the only way to do it right. Otherwise, it's somebody else's idea of what should be done instead of what actually needs to be done. And the answer might be surprising. What you think might be the obvious solution might not be what the community wants. They might be wanting something else. And so not hearing about it, it also helps us to helps us to find creative solutions, hearing what really the community thinks is the problem and what their needs are, what their felt needs are. And that's been eye-opening for me every single time in every single project that I've worked on. Is it's sometimes the solutions or the needs are surprising. And part of engaging the community is hard work, because often people, it's not an easy email, because when we work with a lot of language groups and a lot of technology divide, so it's not like you can do an email blast and people will appear. Often it's door to door or phone calls in many, many different languages, or talking, we're going house to house or engaging people. That takes a lot longer. And then pre-COVID, we would always have food. We would always hold it in a time where people could attend, like after work, provide childcare. So all of those kind of ways to like remove barriers so people could find time to talk about things that matter to them, taking care of food, taking care of childcare, and the right time to meet. So paying attention to, not holding a meeting at 1 PM where, most people would be at work, just paying attention to some of those simpler logistics. And then how do people communicate? Where did they get most of their information? Is it at more local grocery stores? Is it at places of worship? Is it at other gathering places? And then talking to people there.
Okay, thanks. Well, following the advice of listening and making sure that there's some community-driven element, this is the time that we said we would unmute folks, and I'll get out of the way of folks being able to directly engage with panelists. This is a little bit unwieldy to do in a Zoom format, but one of the things we've done, and I mean, forgive me, I'm kind of a low-tech guy, but one of the things that we've done at the Rose Foundation that works pretty well is if somebody wants to ask the question, wave around like this, and then, so first of all, you got to get your video up if you want to ask a question, because fair is fair, you get to see what we look like. But wave your hand like this, and then we'll make you unmuted, and if you've got a direct question, let's just create some space for that without me trying to filter or run herd. So is there anybody else who wants to do that? Let's give them a minute for that to surface. And
yeah, that's good. I'll jump in, Tim. While people think about any questions, I know we receive some questions through the registration link. We asked participants if they had any burning questions to let us know. So I have some of those questions in front of me. Some of them I think can be answered by the panelists. There are some others that are more logistical to the application process that I can answer myself. And there are others that I'm gonna, just pose for you or Kevin to go ahead and, lead those answers. So yeah, I have a question that kind of like echoes what Tahmina was saying in relation to listening to the community. There is not like a direct answer to like what should be done. Sometimes we had a question from our participant that says, how will the Rose Foundation address the decline in green spaces in urban areas, and what are the steps and actions that we are going to help take? And I think that's a question mostly, that it depends. We've been funding a lot of like green infrastructure projects like rain gardens and some community gardens, but like I think the most important thing is the water quality component as well as the community involvement. So I think that's kind of like a question that I'll see if one of the panelists wants to take on, because I think this is something that depends on the applicant and what they think it's best for the community, and what are the ideas that are being brought to create more green spaces, and how that relates to water quality improvement. Any takers?
Well, I mean, depave is number one. I mean, if you depave existing paved areas, that you're gonna, that's the first pathway to green space that wasn't there before, and it will improve water quality because pretty quickly, because on an impermeable surface where, you know, pollution laden water is going directly into the storm drain system. Now it's going to go actually into the ground, and heat indexes will go down. I mean, so that is what it's kind of arduous. It's hard to do. I've done a lot of it, but that fits water quality. It also, in urban areas, that's sometimes the only solution in places that's already been paved over to reclaim it back.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is another question that maybe Robin can help us answer. It says, what project can be done in the Duwamish watershed? They give a specific location near 6017 Avenue to help address drainage to the wetland. So yeah, that's a good question. Very specific.
That is very specific. I'm not sure which location it is. Was that a street address?
6017th Avenue.
Okay. I don't know, but I mean, I guess I would suggest a rain garden. I mean, or, you know, any of this stuff that like Tamina's talking about, bioswales. I think that just one would have to research what the space, you know, what could fit in a space like that. I'm not sure how big it is, but I guess I would suggest a rain garden or something.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, another question that's, I think it's both for Rose and for the panelists is, you know, people are asking about like, what's the, like understanding the process of how Rose funding helps directly supports impacted and vulnerable communities. So I think this is where like the community component in our criteria when we're looking at proposals is very important, because first of all, we have to follow the clean water quality guidelines, you know, posed by the settlement agreements that we have to adhere with. But I think here, kind of like part of the answer from Rose is that we do look at that community component in now, not only how the community is involved, but which community are we talking about, where there's going to be project implementation, and what are even some of the partnerships that are, you know, that are happening through this project, which also brings us to another question about if we consider national organizations with a focused project on Puget Sound. Yes, but it has to be an organization that is partnering with a local organization, or an organization that, regardless if they're national, that they have program already established in that area, you know, to bring some sort of like, you know, understanding of the complexities, not only around water, but also social environmental issues. So I don't know if anyone wants to like add on like, how have you seen Rose funding directly impacting vulnerable communities in a positive way?
I can take this one. One of the things I had in my notes kind of addresses this. I think I was talking about the challenges, and what I find challenging as a member of a small organization is walking the line between the technical aspects of water quality and the need to make it accessible to community, especially in more than one language. And I guess, so then to answer your question, I think it's really just, it's like a puzzle, you know, finding what your community needs and then finding how it fits. I mean, something that I think is so exciting about what we're doing is training folks, you know, job skills, giving them experience, teaching them about this, which is something that's really needed in my community, and then finding the way that segues into water quality and that sort of more technical stuff. I think that finding the middle of those two things is the key. But probably starting with one's needs and then making the Rose Foundation fit the needs of your community.
I would agree with Robin on finding the need, and I think what we seen was as an opportunity is we're always looking for ways to educate and bring up our future leaders. And so one of the things that we notice is that sometimes our young children think that our tribal casinos are the end all be all, and they don't realize the fight and the plight that their grandfathers and great grandmothers went through, even the treaty signers. So, taking that opportunity to educate our youth and our future leaders about treaty rights, and about salmon management, and being able to interweave water quality because it relates to saving salmon, and also reinforcing and helping them understand our inherent way of life, and connecting all those together is truly amazing to see. I think one of the best outcomes that we had not anticipated and planned for was some of our Nisqually youth. They had brought their drums to the youth camp, and we didn't ask them to do that. And they wanted to sing songs, and one of the songs that they wanted to create was or to sing, before we began our day, was to quote Ma, and it's a song about don't forget the water. That was it was the language learned from it was from the late Willie Frank Sr., who was also one of the translators for the Bolt case. A lot of the Indian people wanted to talk in Indian because they couldn't speak in English during the court hearing with Judge Bolt, and Judge Bolt recognized that was important, which also turned the tide. But Willie Frank Sr. was one of the last fluent speakers at the Nisqually tribe. And so, connecting history and also allowing that history to hold us up as we move forward, and trying to create an educational opportunity for youth to see themselves as future managers and future leaders, is what was and has been a very amazing experience.
Thank you. Again, yeah, I think at this point, the other questions that I have here are either, logistical about our application process that I can address a little later. And then there are other questions that are from the audience posed through the registration link that Kevin will help us organize and facilitate, in addition to the questions that are being posed through the chat right now.
Let me jump in on one if I can, because I see one about, does Rose Foundation ever play the role of matchmaker? And the answer is yes, in a bunch of different ways. Often we'll get proposals from groups that don't seem to be referencing each other, but they're working on the same thing. And so as part of our follow-up, we'll ask them, do you know each other? Are you talking to each other? A lot of times when we'll get, because we're clear about our preferences, if you look at our funding guidelines, you'll see some pretty clear statements that there's a priority towards community-driven projects and a priority towards projects that involve impacted communities. And so we'll often get inquiries from larger national groups saying, well, so if we find a community group, do we get a grant? And our answer is, well, you're going to be better off if you find a community group and put them in charge of the grant, and then have them bring you in as a subcontractor and put the community in the lead. So we're pretty aggressive about that kind of matchmaking, and we also, on a follow-up basis, as we're working with grantees, a lot of times we see some opportunities where we think if we introduce people, it'll cross-fertilize, and we do that pretty regularly. I want to make note of the time. It's 7:25. We promised y'all an hour and a half. And I know we're having so much fun we could do it all night. But we're gonna stick to an hour and a half. Um, Laura, this probably is a good time to do any final or to think about any final technical wrap-up questions, and then I'm gonna let the panel have the last word. And so as Laura goes into the final technical questions, I'm just gonna give all the panelists their closing question to think about real quickly. And the question I'm gonna ask each of you to close on is, if a good friend asked you, gee, I just heard about this fund, what's the most important thing you should tell me about applying to it? What would you tell a good friend? So hold that thought, and then we'll go and do a lightning round with you, with the four of you to end. And Laura, back to you for the more technically oriented how to apply questions.
Yes, thank you, Tim. Yeah, there's some questions that they can, the answers are in the eligibility and priorities page that I've shared a couple of times. I'll share that at the end as well. But basically, the funding for this fund is continuous. We're in good shape to continue having 2 rounds a year in the spring and the fall. So yeah, there's going to be funding for 2021. We a question that got asked in different ways is about, especially since the workshop, it's targeted to like small grassroots organizations. An organization, in order to receive funding, must be fiscally sponsored by a 501c3. So you don't have to have a 501c3 status, but you must have a fiscal sponsor. In the last case scenario, the Rose Foundation can act as a fiscal sponsor, and obviously you would have to contact us so we can see how that's going to work. So that's something that was asked in various ways. Then another thing, it's about like in general geography. We do have geographic areas that we have preference or actually requirement towards each cycle, and those are stated in the website again. But basically, more or less, it's from like the Olympia Peninsula all the way up to the end of Snohomish County on the coast. All of these projects should be geared towards, helping the nearest watershed. So that's in terms of geography, because someone asked about projects in Snohomish County. So that's that. And also about the application process, we haven't mentioned, but we're based in Oakland, California, and we do grant making throughout the country, and also related to watershed issues in California and the Pacific Northwest. For Puget Fund, we do have a local advisory board. You can find their bios in our website as well. It's an advisory board of 5 people coming from all sorts of areas of expertise, from tribal involvement and organizing to someone who works at another important funder in Puget Sound area, to individuals who have worked for the EPA and so on in Washington Department of Ecology. So we have a good bandwidth of people that help us in reviewing applications every round. So that's kind of like how we come to consensus at the end of what's getting funded. So those are just kind of like some questions. And there were other questions about what we prioritize. And obviously this workshop has served as an example that we are giving high priority to community-driven projects that have components of justice and equity. Also on our website, you can see a list of allowable projects as well. And also a question that came up was regarding about our like shifting priorities due to the health crisis. I think our job, our work at the Rose Foundation reflects that we are committed to communities and their health and their well-being. So we are being flexible with current grantees on how they can adapt to the current circumstances. Yeah, so those are kind of like, some things that I wanted to bring up. And then I'm also going to post 2 questions here. There's going to be 2 questions through polling that if people can take a few seconds to answer, it will really help us to know who's participating in this workshop in regards to what organization you're with, like what type of organization, and also what are your fundraising and development efforts look like within your group. So I'm going to start with the first question. I hope people see it here. How are your development efforts currently staffed at your organization? And we want to know if, organizations normally have a full staff person that's dedicated to grant writing and development, if they're using various people across the organization to do this, or if it's just volunteers, or if it's consultants or other. So yeah, while that's going on, I'll take a few seconds. And I think that's all on my end. Maybe when this poll is done, I'll put the other one up, but in terms of timing, I'll pass it on to Tim so we can close the workshop with some final remarks from the panelists.
Okay, thanks, Laura. And I think for both you and Kevin, maybe this would be a great time for you to just type your emails into the chat, because that'll be handy for people, and then you can grab them, and that's the best way for folks to follow up. And so here we go. So we're at the end of our hour and a half, and as Laura's doing that and closing out the poll, this is the final lightning round for the panel. You got your friend on the phone. They've moved back to the area. They've told you they just got a great job with some group that's in the area. They heard about this fund, and they want your top piece of advice about how to apply to the fund. Tamina, what are you going to tell your friend?
How does it affect water quality and people?
Your top piece of advice about applying to the Puget Sound Stewardship and Mitigation Fund and getting a grant. What's the number one most important thing you're going to tell somebody they ought to do in a proposal?
Well, it should address water quality issues. So if it has nothing to do with water quality, it's probably not a good fit. So somewhere in there, you got to solve a water quality problem.
Okay. Robin, how about you?
I would say to call the Rose Foundation and ask to have a conversation about your idea.
Okay. Willard, how about you?
Well, make sure that your project that you're going to pursue has the blessing of the community, and how you can demonstrate that blessing. Who you talk to, who's on board, and how long have you been engaged with that community around this project. And be very clear, and don't be afraid to brag about that relationship, because the stronger the relationship, the more likely you are to be well received.
Okay, thanks. And Pagan, we're going to get the last word here. What's your number one advice about applying to this fund?
I would say definitely apply, and don't be afraid to apply, because the Rose Foundation has some very great people that if you aren't a fit for the application, they will work with you to make sure that you get your application right to fit the parameters of what they're looking for in solving water quality issues.
What happened to you the first time you applied?
We were trying to do too much. We wanted to do another cartoon along with the everything else that we were doing, and so we had to readjust and pivot. And your amazing staff helped us accomplish that and fulfill our goals.
She's being diplomatic. We told her no.
Mhm.
Then, then we had a pretty good conversation about why the first one didn't hit it, and then the second one nailed it. So, that works. Well, so I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And as a closing thing, I would like to ask everybody to give the panel a round of applause. Thank you very much, all 4 of you. This has been a great conversation. All right, well, thanks again for joining tonight. We're going to let you all go and get on with your evening, and appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.